Hello. Sounds like the mic's good. All right. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for having me here today, and happy Juneteenth to all of you. I hope you enjoyed the holiday. My name is David Schaefer. I know most of you by now, but I am the chairperson for the city's Wildlife Commission. We've been working since the beginning of 2021, after you decided to form the commission back in 2020. And we're here to present our second annual report to you. Third full annual report. The first one was very truncated, but my plan tonight really is just to kind of go over a little bit of the commission's work, highlight some of what we've gotten done, some of the challenges we've faced, and what our initial recommendations are for the council. And then I'm also going to cover just some of the data and background we have on kind of the elephant in the room, which tends to be deer, because that's what was the impetus for the formation of this commission largely. There's a lot of wildlife issues, but so just kind of by way of background, wildlife isn't something everyone thinks of as a problem or a concern in suburban areas, but it is a growing concern in many communities, including our own. People have noticed over the last decade a lot more deer, coyote, turkey, and other animals in Southfield that they weren't used to seeing. Some of that might be due to our own success in improving the environment, and some of it is probably due to urban sprawl and more habitat getting removed. So there's a lot of factors here, but we've got a lot of wildlife in the city. Our commission's been around since it was formed in 2020, but we didn't start meeting until 2021 when we had a full body. And the mission you gave us was to develop and propose to the council a wildlife program within the city to ensure the safety, health, and welfare of residents and visitors in the city of Southfield and of the wild animals within the city of Southfield. I just want to stress that initially, because even though we focused a lot on deer over the last couple of years, the mission you gave the commission was much broader than deer, and it was to look at a wildlife program within the city. And a lot of the commissioners took that seriously and have really tried to take a multidisciplinary approach to this, thinking not just in terms of residential problems or concerns, but also ecology and biology as well. So what have we been doing? So we've been meeting since 2021 in January. We do have public meetings. They're open to the public, just like the city council meetings. As I will note later, public participation in those meetings tends to be pretty low, so that's a little bit of a challenge. Until this last year, the city was also performing an annual deer survey, an aerial survey using a helicopter that had been going on before the commission was even formed. That was discontinued this year. I'll get into that a little bit more later. But we do have pretty good data on just estimates of what the deer population looks like. We don't have the same type of data for a lot of the other wildlife in the city. We've been working with a lot of local elected officials, both in the city and other communities as well. And we did perform an online survey in 2021 that got about 226 responses from residents. There was a lot of different questions in there, but there was broad support for the city being more active, generally speaking, in terms of wildlife management and wildlife control. A lot of support for more education, habitat restoration, addressing coyotes, and increasing signage. People were a lot more split about what to do with deer in particular. Most people want the city to be more active when it comes to deer, but residents are pretty split over what that means to them and whether that includes killing deer or finding other non-lethal solutions to deal with it. So. Also in 2021, we helped the city develop a no feed the deer, or don't feed the deer ordinance. So that is in effect now. That's ordinance 1748. That one applies specifically to deer. I did hear Mr. Masserone's comments earlier. We do have another ordinance in section 216 of the code it's really dealing with feeding rodents and varmints, but that one's a little bit broader to where if people are improperly feeding, say, wild birds or chickens, with the wrong equipment, code enforcement could potentially look at it. But we can certainly look into expanding some of those if needed. So, and then we did do some town halls and advisory ballot questions too in the last year. So one thing we put on the ballot was an advisory question just to try and gauge residential support for a deer cull. So removing deer with lethal population control, donating the meat using a third party. That got 61.7% of the vote back in November 2022, which is a pretty impressive number, especially considering it was an off-term election year, so it wasn't a big presidential election year. We had pretty high turnout in Southfield. Before that vote, we also did a town hall meeting, which is something I'm going to come back to more. But we actually got the city to work with us and do a promoted town hall event that just focused on deer issues, and basically brought in a few experts to answer, to present information and then do Q&A sessions with residents. And we had about 150 people that showed up for that and were very engaged in the presentation, which was stark contrast to just our general public meetings, which people don't tend to hear about or don't tend to come to. So what I learned from that was that for things involving wildlife and deer, if we really want to communicate with residents, we probably need to do some targeted messaging and make sure we get the word out. So general challenges. Some of these won't be new to you, given that you're all elected officials and you know what some of these challenges look like already. But one that we faced was getting input from residents. You know, being a public body, having public meetings, having a lot of rules that we can follow isn't always the most conducive to getting people to take times out of their evenings while they're trying to eat dinner and come talk with us. So during the last 2.5 years, we've only had one resident show up at one of our public meetings. I've gotten a few informal communications, like people like Paul, who have managed to get to me by calling a number of other people at the city, and eventually I get his contact information. But generally, getting input from residents has been very difficult. So that's one thing we focused on, is increasing public participation and how do we communicate with residents. The fact that deer management and wildlife management is a divisive topic has also been a difficulty, because no matter what you do and what you decide, there's going to be happy people, there's going to be unhappy people. Again, not new to anyone that's in public office. But wildlife management tends to be a particularly divisive subject. And so that's been a big challenge, because people get very heated when they talk about this, and their passions get inflamed, and that can create concerns for maintaining civil discourse and just making sure that people are hearing each other and not just talking at each other. For wildlife management in particular, one challenge has also been the nature of being a public commission. You know, wildlife management decisions are multidisciplinary. They're going to take into public opinion, science, best practices, things that a lot of people have spent their careers working on. They're not always the decisions that lend themselves the best to a group of volunteers making decisions on a committee basis, because you really need unified action and unified voices on a lot of this, and sometimes those decisions are best made by an expert with the training and expertise to really make an objective recommendation. But our commission has done its best to try and put our own personal thoughts and feelings aside and approach this as objectively as we can. But none of us are experts on that either. You know, I'm a lawyer by trade. During the day, I've got a little bit of education in natural resource management from undergrad. I understand that stuff. We had one other commissioner who was a biologist. She understood a lot of it. But the rest of our commission was made up of people who do not specialize in this field. So it was a lot of new information coming to them right away. Fourth big challenge tends to be just municipal financial constraints for deer management. When people talk about deer management, they often think of population control. There's not a lot of great ways to fund that. There's a ton of free money out there in this country for habitat restoration, environmental repair and restoration work, things like that, even money for game habitat improvement at the state and the federal level. I have not yet located a single grant program that will give you money to help control your deer population or any other wildlife population, unless there are disease concerns like chronic wasting disease, and then you might be able to get some money from, say, U.S. Department of Agriculture to control the disease. But that makes it a challenge, because anything the city decides to do in this realm is going to have to be paid for out of the general budget, most likely. There's not many ways to really raise revenue to pay for this, unless you're going to be charging some kind of fee that could be associated with deer. And then the last challenge is, you know, what we have spent most of our time focusing on deer. The city's put some resources into getting good data on that. But when it comes to other wildlife issues in the city, we don't have good data, and they're not easy to study. You know, we have heard residential concerns about coyotes, and especially during the breeding season when they tend to get more active. We don't really have a way to study coyotes. Without hiring someone to go out and tag and track some of these animals, all we get is anecdotal reports from residents. We have a general idea of some areas where they might be at certain times of the year, but we don't even know how many coyotes are in the city, where they're at, where they're being seen most frequently. And the same can be said about pretty much every other wild animal in the city. Wild animals are difficult to track. It's part of the reason why wildlife research tends to be difficult to perform even at an academic level, because you're constantly trying to get money to do a very labor-intensive effort. So those are just some initial challenges that I think should be brought up as we get into what's going on. But I am going to talk a bit about deer, because deer is really the catalyst here. So a little background information you should know. DNR doesn't have a hard, fast rule on this is too many deer in any given area or environment. They've got kind of varying guidelines that depend on the type of environment you're talking about, and the rule of thumb DNR goes with for suburban environments is 20 animals per square mile. That is considered a sustainable amount in a suburban environment. That doesn't necessarily mean if you go above that, deer are going to start starving to death right away. We've got lots of gardens, we've got lots of great food for them out here. It doesn't mean if you go below that, your deer population's in trouble. That's just kind of an average general guideline. So keep that in mind. Some other things to keep in mind is that male and female deer do not behave the same way. So we hear lots of people talk about deer not respecting municipal boundaries and really wandering across the line. That is true. They don't respect our political boundaries, but a lot of the wandering tends to be your male deer. The bucks, the male deer, can wander many miles per day, many more miles per day during the breeding season, so that's in the early fall, early to late fall. So male deer can wander as much as 5 miles per day, 20, 30 miles in a week when they're really on the move. So they really do travel everywhere, and they're the ones that can breed with multiple females and really keep the population blowing up. Female deer are a lot more local in their natural activities. So they tend to find a core area where they live and bed down and stick within a couple mile radius of that core area. And as you see some maps later, that's probably why you'll see some clumping in a lot of this aerial survey data that we have, because the animals find an area that's good for them, like something near a water source with plenty of food, and they stick near there. And those areas tend to be places like along the River Rouge corridor, near our golf courses, and in some of our more sprawled neighborhoods with large lots. So we do have good data on deer here in Southfield, because we did do the survey for quite a few years. We stopped it this last year because the price almost doubled. It went from $3,000 to $5,000 for our share, and the weather conditions this year weren't great either, but one downside of a survey is you need snow on the ground to be able to do a survey, and even then, most experts say that these surveys are an undercount more often than not, because you can only count the number of animals you can find hoof prints for in the snow and track them down. So you normally don't get everything in your survey area. But even with those limitations, since 2018 through 2022, we pretty consistently saw between 245 and 275 deer within the Southfield area during the survey period, which is February. So in the month of February, there was about that many deer hanging out in the city at any one time. But I do want to call your attention to 2022, where we had a bit of a broader survey area, and you can see that if you even extend that survey area by 1 mile in any one direction, you pick up 200 more animals. Just because they really do clump in different areas. They don't respect municipal boundaries. So our population number isn't skyrocketing. It's not decreasing dramatically. We don't really know if it's at an equilibrium yet, but this is a snapshot. So in February, this is kind of a snapshot. That doesn't mean that's where the animals are in the summer or during different time points in the year, but it is more data than most communities have when they start tackling this problem. So I think Southfield should really pat itself on the back for putting some money into this initially to at least get some population estimates. And just by way of reference, our neighbors over in Farmington Hills, they have an average population that's almost double what ours is, that's been observed in February. So a lot of those deer are probably moving. Don't want to beat a horse to death here, but just as a visual representation, these are distribution maps from 2022 and 2021. So you can see that there's definitely some clumping with where the dots are. The dots are, the larger dots mean more than one animal, the smallest dots mean one, but they tend to clump in specific areas. A large amount of the population tends to be west of Telegraph Road and north of 11 Mile Road, but they're starting to move their way further east and into the city more. That being said, a lot of people east of Evergreen or Losser may not see very many deer, so this is a problem of differential impact. Not everyone in the city experiences deer the same way. Second map shows you the same basic information for 2022, just with raw numbers in 1 square mile grid boxes. So remember that number of 20 animals per square mile I mentioned before. If you look at Southfield there in your bottom left quadrant, so between Inkster and 11 Mile and 8 Mile, you can see that there's several areas of the city where we have close to 50 deer per square mile. So for the people living in those areas, there's a lot of deer. And that's more than DNR would recommend too. But we've also got areas in the city, say down in the bottom southeast quadrant, where nobody's seeing any deer. So the deer do not live evenly distributed across the city of Southfield, and that's probably part of the reason for some of the difference in opinion about what to do, because people are experiencing this event differently. They're not all having the same lived experience. So. Deer have cost Southfield some money though too. So like I said, we've been doing the aerial survey since 2018. And we shared those costs with Farmington Hills. We used to pay about $3,000 as our share of the cost. That jumped up to $5,000 in 2022, and it was going to go up even more in 2023 because of the retirement of one of the aircraft, and then just general inflation as well too. So there was a decision made to discontinue the aerial survey for now, at least. That is something we could restart, but right now we've got some good data. Our Public Works Department has been spending a decent amount of money just on roadkill and processing these animals too. So there's a decent number of animals that are hit every year in Southfield or that die naturally. Oftentimes what happens is DPW gets a call asking to have them come picked up from the side of the road. So that results in a work order. It's a couple people going out, usually with a backhoe and a truck, and it costs about an hour of labor for all of that. So it ends up being about $164.87 plus disposal costs and plus the cost of employee benefits. When we tallied up the numbers, the city was spending anywhere from the low 30,000s to upward of $60,000 per year disposing of wildlife, if you take into account the manpower, the benefits, the disposal costs, and the actual removal of the animal. If you take out the kind of the human aspect of that, it was more like $25,000 per year, but it's still a decent chunk of change. And we've also heard some concerns from residents about the fact that there's been difficulties with getting those animals removed if they're on your private property. So DPW's great, happy to pick animals up when they're on the side of a public road, but if they're on the side of your lot, it's been a little bit more difficult. We've tried to work with them to make it easier for residents to just get the animals out to the curb, but there's still not great solutions there, and it's something we should probably keep working on. Car accidents are another issue that is oftentimes brought up as a concern when it comes to deer. You may or may not know this, but Oakland County itself has had the highest number of deer-related car crashes in the state for quite a few years now, almost 2,000 in the year 2019. Southfield has had a decent number of reported car crashes, but they have been pretty stagnant. So I pulled 4 years worth of data from trafficcrashfacts.org, which harvests data from public websites here in Michigan. And in those 4 years, we had exactly 50 or 67 accidents in each of the 4 years that were related to deer. Again, probably an undercount because people got to call it in. But just to compare that to drinking and driving related accidents, we had 74 of those in 2021. So we have almost as many deer related crashes as we do drinking related crashes in the city, at least based on what's reported. And then the city, before it even formed the commission, did take a look at the ecology of this too and had Dr. Jacqueline Courteau come out and do a study on some of our natural areas and parks in 2017 and 2018. I won't bore you with all the details of her report, but basically what she found was evidence of pretty heavy overbrowsing in pretty much all of our parks. And that's largely deer and rabbits, but she was saying a lot of it's deer. And she was looking at the types of plants that were being overbrowsed, and the concern raised by her study was that a lot of the native species that we would like to see growing in our parks, like trillium, and a few of the other native wildflowers that are great for pollinators, those are the ones the deer really target. They like them, they eat those, they don't eat as many of the invasive species that tend to push them out. So not something deer control is going to manage right away, but if you did do it, then you could work with restoring the habitat in the parks as well over time by trying to get out some of the herbivores and then helping ease the native plants back in. But it's going to have to be a holistic approach if that's a goal. So I want to talk just about deer management options, and I'll go through these pretty quick because there's a lot of text up there. So one is just to do nothing, or basically kind of the approach the city has taken. So let nature take its course, which is an option a lot of people advocate for. You know, there's certainly some merit to this. It doesn't cost the city any money directly. It is a hands-off type of thing. And eventually, the wild population will reach some point of equilibrium to where you won't see more deer coming in, you won't really see a ton of deer going out. What that means in reality, though, is that you'll end up with animals starving to death, because that's what natural equilibrium means in terms of a wildlife population, is that you reach a point where the environment can no longer sustain any more animals. Another problem with that is most likely our residents have a much lower tolerance for the animals than the ecosystem does. And so chances are you're going to hear a lot more angry residents before we get to the point of natural equilibrium. Another option is trap and relocate. It's something people propose a lot. So why can't you just catch the deer and move them somewhere else? The simplest answer is that it's not legal to do it in Michigan. MDNR will not approve that. There's disease concerns, there's regulatory concerns, there's cost concerns with it, but the short answer is that we can't legally do it, even if we wanted to. So I'm not going to dwell on that option. Predator reintroduction is another option that I'm not going to spend much time on. Areas like Yellowstone National Park have had a lot of success managing their deer and elk population by reintroducing wolves. We're not Yellowstone National Park. We are a city, we've got residents living here, we've got a limited number of green space. People already get concerned about seeing coyotes in their backyard. Nobody's going to want to reintroduce wolves or more coyotes or something like that in the city, even if we thought it was a good idea. So not going to spend much time on that. It's probably not a legal option either. The next option would be just normal hunting. So some residents have expressed some concern with this. We've got and some interest in it. We've got a group of residents that have approached the city about possibly having local hunters go out and take a couple deer each year if it would help out with the efforts. There's a couple ways you could do that. What I'm talking about right now is just the normal in-season hunting that DNR manages. That's probably not an option for Southfield because our current ordinances don't allow firearms or bows to be discharged within the city. We don't have anywhere within the city that's approved for hunting generally, so even our parks and green spaces aren't approved for it. So there's really not anywhere anyone could hunt during a normal hunting season within Southfield, even if we wanted to authorize it. And the commission was of the view that because of safety concerns with hunting generally, we probably wouldn't want to recommend a in-season normal hunt, because that's really just any of your neighbors who have a tag and a license and a basic firearm safety course going out and taking whatever deer they have a tag for on public property. There's a lot of things that could go wrong with that. So if the city was interested in hunting, we'd propose a more regulated off-season hunt working with DNR on that. So this slide's really kind of where the meat and potatoes of the potential options come. So one would be the out-of-season hunt that I mentioned. You could do this working with local hunters, and basically what happens is that MDNR would work with the city. They'd issue special permits that would allow taking the animals out of season, normally in January or February. There's an application process, a fee process. It's fairly straightforward once you get it all going and fairly low cost. And then you can either use professionals or you can use hunters to remove the animals. So this would be a hunt or a cull. If you're using hunters, you would basically have the city handle the administration of issuing special permits or tags. We could potentially charge for that to help offset the cost for the city. And then you would need someone probably from the police department kind of monitoring the hunt areas. And what you would do is open up certain city parks, maybe find some private landowners like some of the golf courses, or if some of the churches with larger lots wanted to open up and participate in it, they could allow their property to be used off. You'd have to have lots of notice, lots of signage, some oversight, and then for a few weekends or a few evenings out of the year, you would have people come out and do an archery hunt from a tree stand, aiming downward to remove whatever number of deer they have a tag for. So that's using local hunters. You can do it safely. Every city that I've read about that has done this across the country has never had a single problem with it in terms of safety. It's always worked out really well. The concern I do hear about it from the management side is that it's not the most effective way to do population management. For example, the city of Meridian Township up near East Lansing has done a hybrid sharpshooter and hunter operation for quite a few years now. They've got a lot more rural space that they can use and open up for this than we do. They only take about 30 to 50 animals per year using their normal hunters, which is not enough to have a lasting impact on the population, so they use sharpshooters to harvest another 50 to 100 animals each year. And that's how they offset it. But it is an option that's out there, you know, and it would really be sustained based on residential interest and be able to keep the program going. The easier to administer program, but more expensive program would be to use sharpshooters, and that's what most communities have chosen to do if they've taken on deer management. And there really seems to be two pools of sharpshooters you can really draw from. One is private contractors, like a company called White Buffalo, which is what Ann Arbor used when they did their cull. And another would be to work with U.S. Department of Agriculture and hire some of their trained sharpshooters to come out. USDA does tend to be cheaper from what I've been able to find on a per animal basis. I don't know about the limitations on their contract or what they're willing to do. White Buffalo is a bit more expensive, but they kind of are a full in-house shop to where they will come out, they'll write your management plan for you, they will perform initial surveys if you want on population numbers, perform the hunt, help administer getting rid of the meat, and then they will write a final report and let you know kind of some different metrics so that you can gauge the success of the program and work with you to figure out what those metrics are going to be too. So there's benefits to both programs, you know. It does seem like Ann Arbor had probably the most data to support its results when it did it, and it went with White Buffalo, but it also was spending quite a bit more money. And Meridian Township was able to keep its costs low without using sharpshooters, but they were also using the police department as their sharpshooters instead of professionals, and that's an option that hasn't gained a whole lot of interest in Southfield, is having the police department involved in that. So we're probably left with USDA or professional sharpshooters. There is theoretically the option of, instead of using sharpshooters, to capture the animals and euthanize them using chemicals. I haven't talked to any management professional that recommends that, just because there's a lot of additional costs that go into that, as well as liability concerns and more risk of injury for the professionals working. So they tend to stick with a sharpshooter option if you're going lethal management. And then the other bucket of options that gets thrown around a lot is a non-lethal sterilization form of deer management. So this is basically making it so that the deer cannot reproduce anymore. And there's two ways you can go about doing that. One would be a surgical sterilization, which is similar to getting your dog spayed at the vet. It would just be done in the field. So someone goes out, they shoot a deer with a dart that tranquilizes it, they perform a quick field surgery, similar to with like a dog or a livestock, sew the animal up, make sure it's doing all right, shoot it full of some antibiotics, wait until it wakes up and let it go. These surgeries tend to be very successful. One community in Michigan that did do it was Ann Arbor, again, for the first couple of years of their cull. They worked with the sterilization until the legislature actually enacted a short-term law that prohibited DNR from issuing permits for sterilization. But during the Ann Arbor program, they reported no fatalities of animals. It was very effective, so each female deer that was sterilized could no longer reproduce. And they saw effectiveness numbers in the study area that did sterilization that were right on par with the lethal population management. And surprisingly, the costs were not as much more as Ann Arbor was expecting. I think they spent about $10,000 more on that study area than they did in their sharpshooter area for a variety of different reasons, but they were expecting the cost to be higher than they were. And then a final option would be, kind of self-help options. So if the city was to decide not to take as much of an active role and leave it more to residents, we would kind of recommend trying to help the residents a bit more. There's lots of things they can do that aren't foolproof, like planting deer-resistant plants, putting in fencing, chemical repellents, changes to how they garden and landscape. The downside of this really is that it does shift the cost of this public problem onto the backs of individual residents, which also means that for our lower income homeowners and tenants in the city, they may not have the resources to really engage in these types of activities, and so they're really not going to have the resources to beautify their properties and protect them from deer in the same way that wealthier residents would be able to. And so that's just kind of an economic disadvantage to leaving everything to the residents. But we could certainly do more with communicating with the residents about that. So, and then before I get to the recommendations, just a little bit more on the cost, because I did mention cost differentials. So, sharpshooters, you're looking at $400 to $750 per animal is what the White Buffalo Company estimates based on its current costs. And so that's what we pay to the company to come in and administer the program and remove the animals. That does not include any staff time that the city would have to incur for its own staff persons being involved in this operation. So that's something else you'd have to factor in. But if you're considering that you probably need to remove anywhere from 80 to 120 deer per year for at least a 3 to 4 year period initially, the costs do get up there fairly quick. It's not huge, but we're talking about a per animal cost. If you do a managed hunt, so that's what I'm talking about is the out-of-season hunts I mentioned, where we work with DNR, happen in January and February, but we don't use sharpshooters. Those can generally be done at $200 or $300 per animal, and that would include the permitting fees, the costs of working with DNR, and then hopefully we could lump the staff time into that as well. And then the one thing that's an uncertainty there is that you can potentially offset those costs by selling the permits to residents who want to take a deer and bag a deer on their own. So, and then the final main population control idea is the sterilization or fertility control. And these costs really vary depending on whether you're doing surgical sterilization or chemical contraception. I didn't really talk about chemical contraception before because Michigan doesn't really have many of the chemicals approved in the state, but it's theoretically an option. DNR says there's one out there. This tends to cost anywhere from $900 to $1,500 per animal. So you're getting up into the double the cost range as compared with a sharpshooter option. But the benefit of this is that it does keep the animals alive so that you're not killing any animals. The downside is that it takes longer to see results because you got to wait a couple breeding seasons before you really start to see impacts. So, and then one other thing about the fertility control is I was going to say is that the commission, if we were to go with the fertility control, really prefers the sterilization method over the chemical method for a couple reasons. One, it's one procedure in the lifetime of the animal, so lower impact. And two, since you don't have to retreat or use chemicals at all, there's no need to tag the deer and mark it as unfit for human consumption anymore, because if an animal does get chemicals injected into it for fertility control, DNR no longer deems that safe for human consumption. So you got to throw a tag in its ear, and if someone harvests it later, they can't eat it. So a few things there. So with all that in mind, that's all a lot of background information. There's a lot of information in the report, and I'd be happy to field any questions, but I'm going to go over our general recommendations. So we didn't start with the big ticket item first because that one was controversial. We started with kind of the low-hanging fruit. So one is communication and transparency. Not a stranger to anyone in public office, but it is a big factor. And there's been a lot of people that have studied wildlife management issues in different communities, and every single one of them has said that if you want a successful program, the best thing you can do is get residents involved early, help them take ownership of it, and keep them involved throughout the entire process. Because there's always going to be people that are upset, but they're a whole lot less upset when they know what's going on and they feel like they have a voice in the process. So I do think our city's done a decent job at getting started on this, in that you did form a wildlife commission. You've got residents on that commission. We've done some town halls. We've done some surveys. We're trying to communicate with residents. We can do better, though. We can do a lot better than what we're doing now. You know, residents have a lot of interest from the surveys we have done in getting more educational material, going to events, just hearing more about this subject. So we've been trying to work with the city to get more information on the city's website for quite some time now. There was a lot of interest in doing that when I met with the subcommittee. There's still nothing on the website, so I need to follow up a little bit, but we need to get more of the information the commission's been able to gather up on the website. We can use places like Ann Arbor, Meridian Township, East Lansing as role models. They've done this already. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but there's a lot more we could be providing online. It would also be very helpful for residents to have a better or more efficient way of communicating with the commission, whether that's an email address they can send stuff to that would then get forwarded to us on a weekly basis, a phone number, or something. But right now, their options are to go to a public meeting or to call whoever their favorite city official is and hope that through a game of telephone, the communications get back to the Wildlife Commission in some way. But there's got to be a better way for them to communicate with us. You know, when I talked to Mr. Masserone a couple weeks ago, the only reason I even heard from him was that because he called several people in the city, and eventually one of them gave me his phone number and I called him back. But had it not been for that game of internal telephone, we never would have known that he was having problems with wild turkeys. And the same can be said about pretty much every other concern we've heard from residents so far. We also would like to just see the city, when we do make this a priority, speak with a unified voice on it, which is why I think having information up on the website would be great. One challenge we ran into around the time of doing the ballot question was that there were several people with different understandings of what information was out there, and so the commission was putting some information about the number of deer in the city out in its official documents that were going out to the public. There were some individuals in the city making statements on their own, and then there was some other information being put out in the newspapers. All three of them had different information, only one of them was correct. And so there's just the risk of confusion when you have things like objective information about the number of deer in the city, but the city is not communicating with a unified voice on it. So we just want to make sure that the city is going to speak with a unified voice on it if it can. So that kind of leads us into our second recommendation. As I hinted at, wildlife management issues are a difficult thing to be decided on a committee level basis, and oftentimes they are done with someone who is a trained professional in the area, either wildlife biology, zoology, or something similar, digging into the data, digging into the science, and then making an objective recommendation that the city either goes with or doesn't go with. But we think there could be a lot of value to the city bringing on a staff person, either full or part-time, that could focus on wildlife and environmental related issues and then split their time with other departments as needed. I'm sure there's plenty of work that Parks and Rec, Public Works, or some of the other departments could find for this individual. But there's a lot of things someone like this could do. You know, they could be a liaison between our commission, the city council, the city administration, and other communities, working more during the 9 to 5 workday when most public officials are getting their work done, and then bringing that stuff back to the commission, who is all volunteers mostly with day jobs. So we're not answering emails or phone calls for this work oftentimes during the day. A staff person could also kind of serve at the same role that the planning department does for things like the planning commission or the zoning commission, where the priorities and a lot of the hard work and research and reporting is done by someone who's an expert in this area. They bring really well thought out proposals to the commission, and then the commission can debate a bunch of ideas and bring that to the city. But as things have been standing right now, we are really kind of a ship that's been going without a crew. So we have a commission. We've been coming along as best we can, but we've been setting our own agenda, setting our own priorities, trying to find time for the research. And we've taken a lot longer to get to where we are now than we really wanted to. You know, I would just use Ann Arbor as an example again. When they decided to look into going forward with the Cull, the Ann Arbor City Council told the administration that you had 6 months and a small amount of money to go out, talk with residents, talk with experts, come up with a proposal. The city administration in Ann Arbor made it 1 or 2 persons' jobs to do that, and in less than 6 months, they had already conducted several public surveys, engaged with a whole bunch of experts, and came up with a report very similar to what you're seeing today, recommending that Ann Arbor go forward with a Cull. And Ann Arbor was able to get the balls rolling on something much faster than we've been able to, in part because of efficiency, through having 1 person assigned to do this job. But a staff person could do more than just manage wildlife issues. They could also be someone that could look into grants for a variety of different projects the city wants to get involved in. If you ever want to do something like habitat restoration as a part of some of your park improvement projects, there's a lot of funds out there with the DNR or with the U.S. Park Service, things like that that you can apply to, but you normally need to have a full project ready to go with your grant proposal. Who's going to write those grants? Well, someone with a background in this could do that. And they could potentially advise if you have issues. I don't think we have a city arborist, but some cities do. I know we've got regulations on what trees can get removed and what can't. So someone with an environmental background could really fill a lot of different roles in this city, not just wildlife, potentially benefit other departments as well. The third recommendation goes back to this idea that you asked us to create a wildlife program, not just to deal with deer as a nuisance species. And we thought that was important and noteworthy. For one, because it aligns with what a lot of the management texts say. There's not a single wildlife manager out there in this country that says that you should approach deer, wolf, coyote, or other wildlife management on just a myopic species approach. We want to get the numbers of this species down to a certain level. That's just not smart management. You need to think more from an ecosystem approach and what are your goals? What is it you're trying to achieve? So if our concerns with deer are not that there's just too many of them, but maybe that landscape damage is increasing, natural plants in our natural areas are decreasing, and invasives are increasing, and car accidents are up. Well, those are goals and metrics you can work towards decreasing. And if one of them includes habitat, so the natural areas in our parks, you can make habitat restoration a priority. And that's something that could be integrated into our sustainability plan for the city, the commission's work, the Park Services work, and it really could just overlap with a lot of different things we're already doing. But we've already got data from 2017, 2018 showing overbrowsing in our parks. It's probably just gotten worse since then. The problem is that even if we were to remove half of the deer in the city today, those natural plants aren't going to come back on their own. So if we ever want to restore those parks to a more natural native plant environment, we've got to attack the problem of overbrowsing while also dealing with the habitat itself, which could involve having the commission work with Parks and Rec to set up volunteer events for removing invasive species, things like garlic mustard and other stuff that comes back every year. But if you don't get involved in those type of things, then you're really just looking at this as a nuisance problem, and we're really just talking about removing animals for the sake of removing animals. And then the final item is really kind of the big ticket item, is, to cull or not to cull. And I was hoping to have a affirmative recommendation from the commission with a yes or no on this, but there wasn't. In fact, a majority of our commissioners aren't comfortable saying yes or no to cull deer, largely because the consensus is that this is not yet an ecological problem. It's really an individual policy issue and a people problem. Deer are not starving to death in our city. Our citywide average population distribution is well under the recommended numbers. We've got pockets in the city where there is overpopulation. So there are pockets in the city where population control could certainly be justified if that's what the city wants to do. But the question of whether it's a good use of city resources to engage in population control in a few pockets is really a policy decision. It's a financial policy decision. And so that's where the majority of the commissioners were, is that we don't have an answer for you as to yes or no whether to cull the deer, but you do have areas in the city where it would be fully justified if you wanted to. Here's the things to consider with that, though. Population management's a long-term commitment. It's not a one-and-done situation. It's not a three-and-done situation. If the city is going to start managing the deer population, such as killing deer or sterilizing them, this is a long-term commitment the city's going to be engaged in, basically in perpetuity or until we decide we're done spending money on it. The reason is that deer reproduce like rabbits. They reproduce at an exponential rate. A female deer can have 2 to 3 offspring every single year from after it reaches 1 year of maturity through the day that it dies. And one male can fertilize as many female deer as it can win in a rut each year. So the population will continue to grow no matter what we do. And if we are going to engage in population management, it needs to be a long-term commitment from the city. And one concern the commission has had is that we have not seen a single community other than Meridian Township in Michigan that has continued a population management program past 4 or 5 years. Even Ann Arbor, which had one of the best programs out there, I really consider it the gold star, stopped its program after 5 years. And there's been not a peep as to whether they're ever going to restart it. So part of that is that it's controversial, and part of that's that it spends money. But this is something you would need to commit to long-term if you're going to do it. It's going to probably cost more in the first year than it would in years subsequent, and then after that it's going to be an annual expense to deal with the animals. If the city does decide to go forward with population management, though, there were a few things the commission was pretty unanimous on. One is that the commission certainly prefers sharpshooters over a unmanaged hunt or using local residents for hunting. There were several reasons for this. One was just general safety and liability concerns. Two was that there were several people on the commission that viewed the use of a firearm to dispatch a deer as a more humane way of killing an animal than bow hunting. And then there was also just general ideas about efficiency as well, given that the cities we've seen that have done bow hunts, it just normally hasn't been enough to have a meaningful impact on the population. If the commission wasn't really opposed to the non-lethal techniques, other than that they're expensive and that the chemical contraceptions have a lot of side effects to them, so as far as the deer not being edible anymore. So if you were to go that option, we'd recommend the sterilization option, assuming you can get permits for it from DNR still. And then we also had recommended that so that you actually have a firm estimate of costs, that if you're really thinking about doing this before you commit to it fully, that you actually authorize getting proposals from some contractors if you're looking at sterilization or sharpshooting, because the only thing we can do at this point is provide a general cost estimate based on the per animal costs that are reported and then kind of estimating the number of animals that might need to be removed based on what we've seen in other communities with similar populations and similar land masses. But none of the contractors we talked to could give us a firm estimate on what it's going to cost until they actually come out, look at the numbers, write up a plan, and tell you how many animals to remove. And then that animal goal is kind of somewhat up to the city too to set based on what our goals are. So we would recommend getting formal proposals so you can really see the hard numbers before committing to it on a long-term basis, but we would recommend that if you're going to make it a long-term commitment. So don't just make this a 1 or 2 year commitment, but make it at least a 4 or 5 year commitment with the idea that you're going to probably have to continue that if you want to keep the population numbers under control. We really would like the city to be able to work with our neighbors too. I know there's a lot of interest in that. The one downside to that is that with the neighboring communities that have even responded to us, it sounds like most are in a wait and see type of perspective right now. Our neighbors in Farmington Hill have been talking about this a bit informally for a while. They've had some town halls, but there is no indication that there's any intent to put this on the ballot or make a decision about whether to call or not call deer in Farmington Hills right now. We haven't heard back from a lot of our other neighboring communities. Rochester Hill did one call and did it probably the worst way you could by not communicating with residents at all, and they've kind of just done nothing with the issue since then for several years now. So we would really love to work with the rest of the community in this area, but we don't think Southfield should take a wait and see approach and wait in perpetuity for everyone else to get on board. Everyone's waiting for someone to make the first action here, so if Southfield's going to continue being a leader on this, it might as well be us. And we have basically a similar position about the regional coalition that's been formed in Oakland County and with some of the SIMCOG communities. We'd really love to see that work get off the ground and be successful. It would be great to have states and counties having a more active role in this because it really shouldn't be a local problem. But that effort is so early in its infancy that there's just no timeline on when and if anything's going to come of it or how it would be paid for or what it would look like. So it could be several years before that regional coalition really has anything for solutions. So if this is something you want to act on now, I don't see any reason why you need to wait for the regional coalition. Questions you have, I know there's a lot of information in there. Happy to answer questions outside the meeting too. So.
All right, Councilman Cruz.